right, y'all. Welcome back. It is Thursday, day 2 after Easter. I'm recording this now in the living room just after I got back from a run. Isabel's over here on the corner watching The Lion King. Great film, if you haven't seen it. The 1994 animated classic, not the 2018 abomination that was the CGI film. Today, we're moving on. Okay, so it's going to seem kind of like we're getting away from the linear chronological story here. We had Solomon, the kingdom gets divided, and you've got the north and the south. You've got 2 tribes in the south, 10 in the north. But actually, the stories that we're going to be looking at are happening around the same time. And so some of these prophets that we're going to look at are the ones that are actually interacting with some of the different kings. We're not going to get into those exact prophets today, but we will start previewing a little bit of what the prophet's role is and how sometimes they do relate to the kings. So, like we said, and I'll try to give you some time to write down this slide. I know there's a lot of text on it. After Solomon's death, the United Monarchy, right, is split, and you kind of see in this the fact that God's plan for the Israelites would have maybe worked out, right? But the people who constantly were like, well, we have a better idea, right? We want a king like the other nations. And they said, well, our king, we want to, remember they pick Saul, like, we're going to pick the kingly looking guy. And that doesn't work out. The times when it does work out for them are when they have David as king, and David follows God's commands, things work out. At the beginning of Solomon's reign, when he's following God's commands, things are working out. And then we see over and over and over again this emphasis that when you put your desires first, your plans first, things don't work out. And so these earthly desires, these earthly plans are failing. So what are the prophets? Well, the prophets are going to reveal God's divine plans to the earthly people. And so once again, you're starting to see this intermediary between God and his people. The same exact thing we've been looking at with Moses, same thing we looked at with Joshua, this idea that there's always seems to be some kind of go-between, this in-between. And we previewed this a little bit yesterday when we said that we already understand that David is a type of Christ as king, right? And we said, what about a prophet? And so we're going to start looking at that. How is it that we can start to see Christ in the scriptures as a prophet who bridges the gap between God's plans, right, and that instruction or telling of God's plans to the people? So, pretty obvious. Prophets, their main role is to be God's spokespeople, right? That they are kind of God's representative voice on earth, and most of the prophets that we're going to be looking at in a little bit here. Sorry, I got distracted when Isabel just grabbed a penny off the table there. I don't know if you can see her in the background. She's eating some pasta. The prophet's main job, right, is to remind the people of their mission, their task. And so you'll see in here this note right here that they're going to be God's spokespeople that remind them of the covenant, remind them of staying faithful to the covenant and the consequences of not staying faithful to the covenant. And, it's the same thing we've been talking about, right? This idea that when you remain faithful, things will work out. God's going to always remain faithful. But every now and then these humans need to be reminded of it. We always do, right? And then that's that last part there, right? That God's not going to abandon them. And you might be surprised, but I think maybe not so surprised if you think about what's going on right now, of how easy it is to forget that God is not going to abandon us, right? You can look at what's going on in the world and the coronavirus and all the things that are associated with that, and you think God's abandoning us, right? And maybe it's a priest, right, at a homily that you heard, a live stream mass. Maybe it's reading some scripture or something like that, and you hear these words that remind you again, God has not abandoned us. For the prophets, this is going to be one of the big messages, especially when we get to Isaiah, because when the Israelites face some pretty tough times coming up, it's really easy for them to think that God has abandoned them. And it's an important reminder to remember that even if things seem bad in your human vision, right, your human eyes, that doesn't always mean that they are in fact bad. And so even today, right, we can use that sort of prophetic reminder that God has not abandoned us, that things may appear bad to our eyes, but they may not in fact be as bad as we think. And it's worth, again, remembering that. So here's a picture of some of the prophets, and let's just jump right into it. Okay. Now, who is considered a prophet? What's the role of the prophets? Like, what would happen to them? This picture that's on the board right now is a little misleading, so that's why I'm going to explain it. When we talk about the prophets right now, what we're referring to is specifically the prophets of the Old Testament that we would consider prophets proper, right? Now, we've got this icon here that says, St. Paul is a prophet, Moses is a prophet, David's a prophet. And this is true in the sense of people that have this prophetic voice that reveals something about Christ. And so you'll see the title of this icon, Reading Christ in the Scriptures. That's, of course, the title of our course. And so in a lot of ways, Moses is a prophetic voice. David is a prophetic voice because they reveal something about who Christ is, even though Christ has not yet come. And then for St. Paul's case, right, he's known as the great apostle who reveals something of who Christ is after Christ has come. So what's going on here? Well, in all of these instances, and then again, we're going to talk about the prophets properly understood in the sense of just a few of the prophets. But what's going on here is that the prophets, all of them, face a similar kind of structure in their story. They're going to endure some kind of ridicule, some kind of torture, right? Some kind of mockery for the sake of the message that they're giving. And we're not necessarily talking about the guys on the street corners with the signs that say the world's going to end in 20 days. And we're not saying guys that say, I'm going to give you a prophecy of like, I don't know if you've been watching Harry Potter on ABC Family or something, right? Like this prophecy that something's going to happen. That's not what we mean by the prophets. But they do face sort of that ridicule of being like crazy people, right? Why? Because they are trying to say the things of God to people that have largely forgotten or abandoned the idea of God. And so you think about like when you're in a bad mood, right? When things are not going well in your day, and your mom or your dad or your sibling tries to comfort you and tries to remind you that things are in fact good and that you're loved. Typically, you shove that person away, right? Like you push them away and say, I don't want to hear this. And then maybe you'll get even more angry at them or something like that. That's kind of what goes on with the prophets, is that they bring the word of God to a people who don't always want to hear it. And they can be mocked and ridiculed because of that. Now, the first prophet that we're going to actually look at, Jonah, the story is a little different. So we'll sidebar that one. And again, we wouldn't necessarily consider Moses in this section. We wouldn't consider St. Paul in this section. We wouldn't really consider David in this section. When we talk about the prophets, we're really talking about Isaiah, Elijah, the guys that you usually hear with the prophets. But I want to mention them in this, and there's a tradition to understand everyone, especially every Christian, to be baptized priest, prophet, and king. Of the main mission of the prophets is to reveal God's love for his people. And so that's why they do these things, right? If you think of St. Paul, again, not necessarily a prophet in the chapter that we're looking at, but St. Paul endures all kind of sufferings, all kind of mockeries. He gets thrown into prison. Why? Because he wants to show God's love for his people. He's willing to risk that for the sake of that love. And that's what you see with the prophets and the stories we're going to look at for the next unit or so. Okay. So, just like we talked about before with the elements of election in terms of like the patriarchy, when we talked about Abraham and Isaac and those guys, the prophets have a certain narrative, right? And it follows a very similar structure, and you'll see it play out in the stories that we're going to look at, especially with Isaiah and some of these guys. But we'll go through this really quickly. I'm not saying that you need to have this entirely memorized just yet. But just keep this in mind. I know you can't go back really quickly when we talk about these other stories, but when you watch the Bible Project videos about each prophet, Isabel tried to eat her rosary. She did not want to eat it. When you watch the Bible Project videos of these prophet stories, go back to this and see how they hit the checkpoints of this call narrative. So the first one is that God's going to engage the prophet, right? He's going to have some sort of first message to the prophet, and they have some sort of brief introductory conversation. And usually at this point, God gives them a mission, right? So that's the second point, commission, that they're given some kind of task. And I think, if you think about like any superhero movie as well, the same thing happens. Is that Isabel? Give me 1 second.
3 hours later.
Okay, back. Sorry about that. She was trying to swallow a penny. So, where were we? We're talking about the call narrative, point 3. What happens when they finally get this mission? A lot of times what you're going to see is the prophets have some sort of objection. And you see this, I was going to say before, the penny incident. The prophets usually, just like most movies, right, there is some sort of like, I can't do it. You got the wrong guy, right? Like think of every superhero movie you've ever seen. They come up with some excuse, right? Whether it's the Avengers, whether it's I remember one of the movies that really hits this home for me is Unbreakable. I've never seen M. Night Shyamalan's Unbreakable. It's like you've got the wrong guy, and they come up with a bunch of excuses of why they shouldn't be the one doing the thing. Very similar to the election narrative structure as well. The next thing that usually happens though is that God is going to give them some sort of reassurance, some sort of guidance that says, no, look, I'm going to be with you. You're going to be able to do this. I'm sending you out to do this. And usually that's then marked by some sort of sign, right? Some sort of, not necessarily always a miracle, but some sort of image of God's support, that God is going to be with them. And then after that, right, they go and do the very thing that they're called to do. And you can kind of then look back on these first 5 sort of points and say, okay, if God's got this overarching plan, right? And that that normal human doubt can creep in. Has God abandoned us? I'm not the guy for this. You want me to go tell these people? Who am I to go talk to a king, right? And yet you kind of look back on the past and you realize how God was working throughout the entirety of that first part to allow you to do the very thing that he had called you to do. And this is an important point for the prophet stories of how it relates to us now, is if we're baptized priest, prophet, king, well, sometimes, you might get this message from God, like maybe I'm supposed to join Sodality, right? Maybe I'm supposed to join the Pro-Life Club. Maybe I'm supposed to go to DC for the March for Life. Maybe I'm supposed to, tell my parents, look, hey, I want to, when all this coronavirus stuff is over, I want to go to Mass on Sundays again. And you feel this voice in your head that says, like, yeah, I should speak up for my faith. And you kind of maybe then, though, you hear that voice, that's 1 and 2, right? This conversation and commission. And you come up with the excuses. Well, I mean, like my parents are in charge of the house. I'm not the guy to make that suggestion. Or, well, I'm only in 8th grade, 9th grade next year. I got plenty of time to join the Pro-Life Club or to join Sodality. I'll figure it out later. And if you hear that call, right, rest assured that God is not going to abandon you. And then when you go out and do those very things that you were called to do, you kind of look back at those moments of doubt or those first moments of conflict or conversation, and you realize that God was working the whole time to give you the strength and grace to do the very thing you're called to do. Now, what about Jonah? He's the first prophet we're going to look at. We got our cartoon here, not the Bible Project. I don't know what kind of animation they're going for here. I really don't. We're not going to watch this one. I just thought the image was funny. Jonah, the reason we're going to look at Jonah first is he's kind of the opposite. It doesn't actually play out exactly like the call narrative. Now, you're going to see a lot of these same elements. You're going to see confrontation. You're going to see the objection for sure. I mean, you're going to see the commission, but you're going to see the objection. You're going to see the reassurance. You're going to see multiple signs for Jonah, and yet the Jonah narrative is a little bit different. So what we're going to do now is we're going to turn over to the Bible Project to give us our first sort of look into the prophets. And then tomorrow we're going to do, instead of watching the Jonah video tomorrow, we're going to watch it today. And then tomorrow we'll start with the Jonah notes. You don't need to take these notes right now. But I want you to see when you watch the Bible Project video these five points to the narrative, the call narrative structure. Okay. The questions for today will be pretty simple. It's not going to be about Jonas and about the prophet questions. But I want you to start thinking about in your own life, right? Where have you noticed some of these things happening and how have you responded? And then when you watch the Jonah story for today, ask yourself, have I responded like Jonah or have I responded like the sailors or the Ninevites? It's an interesting question to think about. How do you respond when you hear God's call? So that's it for today. I'm going to go check on Isabel to make sure she is not eating anything she's not supposed to be eating. And I will see you guys in the next one.